Morning, everyone. So I'm just at the end of having had man flu. But I am going to be all right. I think we know it's pretty serious, but I'm on the mend. So the last talk of QChurch is it's an amazing thing. And of course, I'm not the right person to reflect on the QChurch journey, but I can reflect on it for me. And I just thought I'd do that for a moment. And I would say quite honestly that the last 18 months has been amongst the most productive in my life in terms of intellectual stimulation, curiosity, and thinking about how I believe and also what I believe. And it's been a real privilege for me to be a part of your journey. So thank you very much for that. A special thanks to Jenny for two things. Firstly, giving me the opportunity to be involved after what is possibly the weirdest email I've ever written. Hello, you don't know me. But quite honestly, I'm not sure that Q would still exist without Jenny. And I think we all owe her a huge debt of gratitude. So what I'm going to try and do today is a QChurch style talk that kind of ends up at the forum. And just a warning, I've already had a meltdown over this talk yesterday. So it's not the talk it was the day before yesterday. And maybe we'll decide that that's not a good thing, or maybe it is. But let's start with the first clip, if we could. So I'm going to end at the beginning, and I'm going to go back to Genesis. And in so doing, I'm not assuming that you all think Genesis is an inspired book by God, but Genesis is, at the very least, a book of ancient wisdom that I think still talks about the human condition. And I do remember some interesting discussions about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and things that sparked off a few months ago. And so I think it still has something to say to all of us. John Walton, who actually emanates from a conservative evangelical college in the US, put forward a completely radical reinterpretation of Genesis, and of course inevitably got into quite a lot of trouble. Whether or not he's right, I think he introduces some really interesting ideas that help us think about the human quest. And the human quest is what I really want to think about, and I want to try and build that bridge through the human quest between QChurch and the forum at Q. He says Genesis is nothing to do with the origins of the physical universe. It's nothing to do with science. It takes on the worldview of the time, and it's purely theological in nature. He says the physical universe was assumed to already exist at the beginning of Genesis. And he basically says that the creation story is about God imposing order on a pre-existing world. Now, I have to say, having reread the days in the light of that hypothesis, it still sounds to me more like the traditional view, because in the first 3 days we get light, we get the Earth's atmosphere, and we get continents. I'm not sure it's easy to imagine what was beforehand, if there was something beforehand. But I do like part of what he says, which is creation is as much about the formation of order and the creation of the first sacred space, which was the Garden of Eden. Order from chaos is actually the common theme of all the creation stories of the world, just about. They all describe in one way or another the formation of order from chaos. But specific to Genesis is the commission that God then gives to humans after creation. This is Genesis 1:28. It says, "Have many children, so that your descendants will live all over the earth, and bring it under their control. I'm putting you in charge of the fish, the birds, and all of the wild animals." Somehow humans were given the mandate to continue to establish order, somehow in a similar way to God, because it's in the context of the image of God narrative. So there's something, according to Genesis, there's something about humans that continue the creative work of God to create order out of chaos and to establish dominion over the world. And I want to explore the nature of that quest. And I want to explain, as implausible as it sounds at the moment, why this might have something to do with the forum. But first of all, let me try and explain Walton's ideas. I've failed on the slides already. Can we have the slide of the sea, please? So Walton introduces two ideas, really, at this stage. And the first is what he calls non-order, or chaos. This is wild nature, and it's often symbolized by the sea. And you'll remember, most of you, in the very early part of Genesis, it says, "Now the earth was formless and empty, darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters." This kind of non-order is random, it's amoral, and it's impersonal. These are just the forces of the natural world, if you like. And interestingly, and I'd love to talk about this more because sadly I find it super interesting, the serpent is typically a creature of chaos, not a creature of evil. That's a discussion for another day. But in this world of non-order, there is a need to cultivate, classify, and basically exercise dominion for humans. Now, this kind of non-order can create what philosophers call natural evil. The problem with that term, I think, though, is evil sounds deliberate, and this is not at all personal. This is just the forces of nature doing their thing. So that's non-order. Can we have the next slide, please? And the purpose of humans, according to Genesis 1:28, is to bring order, to tame, to cultivate, to classify, and to control this non-order. And it's not surprising that one of the first things we see, and I've talked about it before, is Adam spends time classifying all the animals. It's part of the ordering process of the non-order of creation. We have the next slide, please. But then something happens and we have the fall. I don't want to go into the fall because that's another talk in itself, but suffice to say that after eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the humans are evicted from the garden to the east of Eden. And the east of Eden is back into non-order. It's not the beautiful created and curated space that God made. It's the tangled thorns and lack of order of the wild natural world. And that actually makes some sense of the curse. Talks about how hard they're going to have to work and how difficult it's going to be. That's because they've left this beautiful space and now they're having to impose order on a new space the hard way. Walton believes that humans were always mortal, according to Genesis, but because they could eat from the tree of life, they effectively had immortality. But as soon as they left the garden, they couldn't eat from the tree, and so they started to die. And that was the beginning of their mortality. But now we have something new. Not the non-order of the wild natural world. Now we have disorder. And disorder is moral. Disorder is what philosophers call moral evil. And this is when people start doing bad things to one another. And it's just a few verses before we get the first murder. So now we have non-order and we have disorder in the world. Now, there was no mandate given to humans to exercise dominion over disorder. So this is a new problem for everyone. But despite the fall, Genesis shows that humans continued to establish order in the world. In Genesis 4, we see that they're cultivating land and livestock. The first city is established by Cain and his wife in chapter 4 as well. And beyond the interruption of the flood, Genesis 10 already talks about nations. So we see human flourishing taking place. We see humans exercising order. The first section of Genesis culminates in chapter 11 when they try and build the Tower of Babel. And I don't really know what's so wrong about it, although I'll come back to some observations. Walton suggests it was a misguided attempt to recreate sacred space that somehow went awry. But interestingly, if you just look at the wonders of the ancient world, look how many of them are also attempts to build sacred space. We've got the pyramids, we've got the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, the Temple of Artemis. That's just a few of them. So we see humans creating order and also creating forms of sacred space that in some ways mirror the original idea of the garden. In more recent times, we see humans accelerating control. We had the Industrial Revolution, where humans learned to automate control over physical space. And now we have a digital revolution in which humans are creating order in virtual space. So there's absolutely no question that humans have continued to fulfill the mandate of Genesis 1:28 and to exercise dominion and to create order amidst both non-order but also disorder. So we're just going to have our first little discussion so I can have a drink. No, I promise you it was planned. Just on your tables and just for 5 minutes, what do you think about the idea of order, non-order, and disorder? Does it make any sense to you? Do you think it explains anything? Is it confusing? Just spend 5 minutes. I don't know what you made of those ideas. I thought they were quite intriguing. But here's where it takes an interesting turn. And of course, you've been waiting for it to take an interesting turn, haven't you? But this middle section is the bit that actually really intrigued me, and I'm hoping it will intrigue you. Could we have the clip, please?
Words. Words have the power to change the world. Words have the power to unite or divide us. They are sang, written, screamed, and felt. They overcome silence with a meaningful sound. They make you think, act, and dream. They tell stories that never happened and promise dreams that will. Words are your voice, your power to change. They are the triumph over the silent monotony of a joyless life. They are ideas and aspirations, and a single word is an action, and it does matter.
So here's the really weird thing. God creates by speaking. We all know it. In Genesis, it's "and God said." Even Jesus, who's described in 1 John as the agent of creation, is called the Word when he's being described that way. Again, several other creation myths talk about the world being created through speech. But surely creating things is just like a big craft project. It's a doing thing, right? We do it kind of with our hands. But on reflection, it's clear that in the Genesis narrative, and maybe in general, action is the final link of the chain. And in Genesis, it's so incidental, it's not even described. So what happens instead is first, there's a collaborative imagination. There's an intent. And then that's followed by speech, and that in turn is followed by action. In Genesis 1:26, it says, "Then God said, let us make humankind in our image." So there's an imagination and an intent, first of all, that's spoken out. And then in verse 27, it happens. So language precedes action and defines action. Could we have the slide with... I asked ChatGPT 4.0 to produce a garden made of words, and that's what it created. Could we have the next slide, please? So before talking about human language, I just want to acknowledge that other parts of the natural world communicate, from trees to bees, whales to wolves, ants to plants. I don't know if you've ever heard of the Wood Wide Web, but I now have. It's clear trees and plants are talking to each other and doing stuff that's quite boggling. And maybe that's another talk for another day as well. That's 3 talks, I think, already. I've teed up. Yeah. However, humans have taken language to a whole new level, literally. In a fascinating book, Simon Prentice, it's called Speech, explains that for all other species, language is analog. So one sound means one thing. And in English, we only make 44 unique sounds. And if we were like all the other species, we would be able to define 44 things, because there's a one-on-one correspondence between the sound we make and a thing. Actually, it's bees that are more sophisticated than that. But that's in my 3rd talk that I've teed up. Humans, though, have digitized sound. So we can combine sounds to make words, and that gives us a massive range. So, k is one of the 44 sounds we make, a is another, and t is another. We combine them and form the word cat. And that means rather than being limited to 44 things we can talk about, we can now talk about 600,000. And we can talk about them in relationships that we call syntax or grammar. There are 7,000 languages in the world, and they all work in exactly the same way, including the logographic ones, like Chinese writing. Even though it looks different, it's actually working in the same way. And here's a mysterious fact. We've only had language for 100,000 years. Prentice, in this book, is very skeptical about the religious explanations for how language came into the world. But he says that the scientific explanations are currently no more convincing. We actually have absolutely no idea where language came from, which is interesting in itself. But, and I should just say, when I'm talking about language, I'm also aware, particularly when I'm talking in Q, we also communicate through images, movement, and music. But these are all actually variants of language. In fact, there's some fairly recent research that shows that music works almost exactly like a language in terms of how the brain processes language. The field that includes language and those other things is called semiotics, and it's a really interesting field. It's probably talk number 4. So when I say language, just assume I also mean the other things as branches of the same linguistic field. As soon as we had language, it was possible to share ideas, it was possible to collaborate, and then it was possible to do things. And that's the exact sequence in which we see God working in the creation narrative. We conceive of something, we build that vision together, we collaborate, and then we do things and things change. Some people call it civilization. Civilization is actually not possible without language. And so all the farming and the city building and all these things that we see in the later parts of Genesis, they all derive from our ability to communicate. It's very interesting to me that in the story of the Tower of Babel, the ability of humans to do the thing that displeased God is actually attributed to their common language. And God limits them by making it impossible for them to speak to one another. Another little anecdote that shows the power of language. And just for fun, and to go back to Kev's talk, it does look as if maybe, in the Bible at least, we've got the ability to create using words in the spiritual space. John 15:7, if you abide in me and my words abide in you, ask whatever you wish and it will be done for you. We're back to the whole manifesting thing. Maybe the mandate of Genesis 1:28 extends further than we thought. It's not just fish, it extends to Snickers bars and other things in the spiritual space. Until November 2022, we were essentially unique in our ability to use language in this way. But then we were joined by generative AI. We just have the next slide, please. Generative AI can learn languages, and in fact, in the early training of models, generative AI learned languages that no one intended the model to learn. It's called emergent properties. And if you connect generative AI to 3D printers and robotics, it can then go on and do the things that it is talking about. So for the first time, we are joined by something else that can conceive creative thoughts in language and currently, in a pretty limited way, enact them in the physical world. And even though it's pretty rudimentary and it's pretty early at this stage, I think in these sort of theological and philosophical terms, it's a big deal, because it's the only other thing in the universe that can do it except us. Now, you could argue AI is like an instrument of humans and it's going to help us establish order. Or you could argue that it's potentially going to establish its own quest as a rival to us in due course. You can see it, therefore, as contributing to disorder. Let's just spend 5 minutes having a conversation about two things. What do you think about our unique ability to have language? Maybe this is really old news to you, but what do you think about that? Where do you think it came from? Have you read anything? Do you have any ideas? And also, do you have any thoughts on whether AI is going to help or hinder the human quest to establish order in the world. 5 minutes.
What we're looking for is how everything works. What makes everything work? It has to do with curiosity. It has to do with people wondering what makes something do something. There's a way of looking anew, as if you never saw it before, for the first time, and asking questions about it as if you were different. And then to discover that if you try to get answers, that they're related to each other. Things that make the wind make the waves. And the motion of water is like the motion of air, is like the motion of sand. Things have common features. Turns out more and more universal. It's almost unbelievable. The truth is so remarkable, so amazing. It's incredible. Take the world from another point of view. It's curiosity. It's the where we are, what we are.
Just like a runner gets a kick out of sweating, I get a kick out of thinking. I can't stop.
It's curiosity.
That was Richard Feynman, the physicist, doing the voiceover. So we've imposed this extraordinary order, we've achieved these amazing things over the course of the human quest. But we haven't finished the job. We have the next slide, please. We have actually not been able to deal with all the non-order in the universe. And that's just a river here that we can't stop flooding the city. But as you well know, we have adverse weather, pandemics, natural disasters. We have not been able as humans to impose order in totality on the non-order of the universe. And we are still subject to sickness and aging and ultimately death. We've slowed it. We can do things about it that we couldn't do, but we haven't dealt with the fundamentals of those processes. Similarly, could we have the next slide, please? We have added considerably to disorder in the universe, and technological innovation has only made that worse. Anyone who's seen Oppenheimer has seen all the dilemmas of that. In fact, the 20th century has been the deadliest in history. Over 187 million people have been killed by other humans since 1900. And if you add to that exploitation, discrimination, corruption, cruelty, and greed, we can see that disorder is still prevalent in our world. And this is post-Enlightenment. You know, this is after we became rational, which is why I've got some reservations about the Enlightenment as telling the whole story of human beings, because somehow we don't seem to live up to our potential in this respect, despite me thinking the Enlightenment was a good thing, just for the record. So what have I argued so far? I've argued that God created order from non-order and gave humans a mandate to do the same. I've argued that this is achieved through language as we exchange ideas and collaborate together, which leads to action. However, so far, we've not overcome either non-order or disorder, and there's still a lot to do. And so what do we need to further the human quest? I think we need a coffee house. Because if anything that I've said is even half true, in order for humans to progress order, to address both non-order and disorder, they need freedom to talk, to be in a dialogue, to use language to create new possibilities. And that has to be done without the threat of being cancelled, trolled, or censored. If it's true that language is right at the heart of humanness and the human quest, we need places to exercise language in that powerful, collaborative way in order to imagine new futures that ultimately turn into action and reality. To that end, I think we need new sacred spaces in the spirit of the ecclesia that you've been talking about. Places where we can consider all dimensions of reality together. However imperfectly, however provisionally, however fallibly, we need places to talk and explore and debate and think together. Because talking shops are not just talking shops, it turns out that they determine the course of human history. And even if you don't believe it's anything to do with being made in the image of God or any of that, I think it's clear that human language and dialogue and civilization arising from it has had the biggest impact on human history of anything else. And for me, that means that we can celebrate everything that QChurch has been. I think it's been an amazing journey. But I'm excited about the forum at Q, because the forum at Q for me is right at the heart of what it means to be human. It's right at the heart of what it means to create things with words. It's right at the heart of the human quest to bring order to a world that's still a work in progress. And that's why this is not the last word of Q, it's just the last word at QChurch. And I'm really, really excited about your future, and I'm really looking forward to being a part of it with you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for that, Rob. That was awesome. Really giving us some great things to think about. And that concludes our final QChurch. Amazing, eh? So I read a quote this week that really stood out to me. Devotion to the truth is the hallmark of morality. There is no greater, nobler, more heroic form of devotion than the act of a man who assumes the responsibility of his thinking. My dad would always say, "We are not here to tell you what to think, but teach you how to think." And this is what it's always been about, thinking. It is ideas that shape, mold, and create our world. As we move into our next chapter, the Forum. I do so with great expectation that amazing things lie ahead of us. However, to keep the fire burning, we must continue to fuel it by remaining true to our values, without appeasement or apology. Our quest for exploration and discovery will always trump the desire for security and certainty. We could be very easily just remain as we are, but we aren't a cruise ship, we are an icebreaker. It's the settler that opts for a bowl of soup. It is the pioneer that seeks to reach the promised land. We have lost many along the way for many different reasons, but we have also welcomed new faces along the way and hope you will all join us on this new adventure. We hold on, we move on, knowing that the fire cannot be betrayed as we continue to give it shape and purpose. At the core of our aim is the desire to see people live happy, fulfilled, and successful lives. Historically, we were guilty of believing the more you martyr, the more you suffer, the more you sacrifice, the more heroic you were. Oh, how we have changed. If the idea of being transformed by the renewing of your mind applies to anything, it is that our message and purpose is not to suffer and die, it is to thrive and to live. And we are here every step of the way to offer you the tools that will nurture and feed the joy within you. Can it be challenging? Can it be uncomfortable? Can it be a struggle? Well, the last 15 years answer that question. But the process has birthed beauty out of ashes, along with a maturity, a wisdom, and a strength that shines a light to inspire others out of their own darkness. And so in closing today, and as we close QChurch, I'll leave you with one last quote. Ask yourself whether the dream of heaven and greatness should be left waiting for us in our graves, or whether it should be ours here and now on this earth. Well, the Forum at Q believes and serves to realize the latter. I hope you've enjoyed this morning. Wishing you all the best for a great summer, and we look forward to seeing you in the next chapter. Thank you.